Good evening and welcome to the final night of the 2019 Penn World Voices Festival here in New York, to the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write Lecture with Arundhati Roy. I'm Chip Raleigh, director of the festival. On behalf of PEN America, I would like to say a few words, just a few brief words about the organization. PEN America is an organization that exists to support literary culture and to unite writers and their allies to defend the liberties that make that culture possible. We work to ensure that people everywhere have the freedom to write, to convey information and ideas, to express their views, and to access the views, ideas, and literatures of others. This festival was founded 15 years ago to feature and celebrate the global community of writers whose works and ideas give our culture here in New York and here in the United States of America sustenance. I'd like to thank the sponsors, supporters, volunteers who make the Penn World Voices Festival possible, and I'm just going to run through a brief list. The New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, Amazon Literary Partnership, the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Poetry Foundation, WNYC, The Guardian, New York Magazine, and New Republic, and we thank them all. It has been an absolutely extraordinary week for us. This year's festival, with the theme Open Secrets, looked at the dissolving line between the public and the private. We chose this theme to address the growing concern with the ways the algorithms that drive our technological innovation can sometimes be deployed against us. But we've also chose that theme because we have a sense of awe at the change that can come when an individual places their personal, private story in the public arena. Throughout this week, writers have told their stories, in many cases, stories they have never told before in public, and have revealed their innermost thoughts and secrets. New Yorkers packed venues to hear Tara Westover tell Min-Jin Lee about Tara's unconventional upbringing, and Colm Toibin and Edouard Louis talked movingly about their fathers in life and in literature. And just last night, 6 writers demonstrated their immense trust in this festival and in the people of New York as they stood up to share very private moments of deep pain in our event, It Happened to Me, an experience we know brought new empathy and understanding to the devastation wrought by sexual assault, brutal experience of genocide, and the political and ethnic hatred spurring people to leave their homes. As the city of New York gets ready to mark the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots and the birth of the gay liberation movement, we heard 4 artists, writers, journalists, and a choreographer among them, reveal to us their understanding of the law of desire. We heard from dreamers throughout the festival, including 2 who fled violence and sexual assault in Central America to make the journey north, crossing the US-Mexico border as young teenagers alone. At the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, not far from here, we heard the Reverend William Barber share the story of his darkest moment when at the age of just 31, he was diagnosed with a debilitating disease that sent him into a depression during which he asked whether he would ever work again. Fortunately for the world, he has been able to emerge from that to continue his work. The Reverend Barber made the connection between his work and the activism of the young Chinese students who filled Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, protesting for free speech and democracy. At that event, we heard first-person testimony, eyewitness accounts to history from Wang Dan, Fang Zheng, Zhou Fengsuo, and the novelist Ma Jian, and others who told us what it was like to taste freedom for the first time in what was for them the most hopeful moment in modern Chinese history. And tonight, we will hear how a writer of the most beautiful lyrical fiction and the most powerful political essay incorporates what she has witnessed into her work when Arundhati Roy takes the stage in just a few moments. After she delivers the 2019 Arthur Miller Lecture, She will be joined in conversation with the novelist and essayist Siddhartha Deb, author of the Orwell Prize-winning The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India. And now, to tonight's special guest. To many, Arundhati Roy is a puzzle. Is she that lyrical writer we speak of, the author of the Booker Prize-winning The God of Small Things, and more recently, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness? Or is she instead the powerful political essayist who has drawn the world's moral gaze toward the poor, those who have suffered from environmental degradation, ravenous corporate exploitation, and ingrained misogyny and sexual violence, the author of The Algebra of Infinite Justice, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, and with John Cusack, Things That Can and Cannot Be Said, and the forthcoming My Seditious Heart. Look out for that. It's going to be published here in the United States on June 4th. For us, of course, these movements between genres and between writing and activism do not reflect any contradiction at all. There is, of course, a very clear through line connecting her substantial and wide-ranging contributions. For us, in PEN, and for us here tonight, this is the work of a public intellectual, and this is the responsibility of the writer. And I suspect if anyone remains puzzled by that still, tonight's lecture will make that connection and that through line very plain indeed. So tonight, now, without further ado, these are words I never thought I would ever say, and which I am immensely proud to say. Please join me in welcoming Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a strange moment to be here for me today because it's election time in India, and today is the day that my city votes. So the lecture today is called A Place for Literature. I'm truly honored to have been invited by PEN America to deliver this year's Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture. Had Arthur Miller and I belonged to the same generation, and had I been a US citizen, I suspect we'd have bumped into each other while we answered summons to the House Un-American Activities Committee. In India, my credentials are impeccable. My name is high up on the A-list of anti-nationals. In fact, someone who was organizing this lecture, one of the organizers told me that they had called the Indian embassy to ask them to help out, and they didn't get an answer. I said, if they had answered, they'd have been sacked. So in India, my credentials are impeccable. My name is high up on the A-list of anti-nationals, and that's not because it begins with A. These days, the list has become so long, there's a good chance that it might soon overtake the list of patriots. Of late, the criterion for being considered anti-national has been made pretty simple. If you don't vote for Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, you're a Pakistani. I don't know how Pakistan feels about its growing population. Sadly, I won't be able to vote for anybody this time around because today, May 12th, is the day that Delhi, my city, votes. My friends and comrades, excluding those who are in prison, have been queuing up outside election booths with their hearts in their mouths, hoping the fate of Turkey and Brazil does not await us too. I don't believe it will, but for the record, I accepted the invitation to speak here before the dates of the election were announced. So if Mr. Modi wins by just one vote, remember you all share the blame. Anyway, here we are in legendary Harlem in the Apollo Theater, whose walls have heard and perhaps secretly archived the heart-stopping music that has been made here. They probably hum to themselves when no one's listening. A little Aretha Franklin, some James Brown, a riff by Stevie Wonder or Little Richard. What better venue than this hall full of history to think together about a place for literature at this moment in time when an era that we think we understand, at least vaguely, if not well, is coming to a close. As the ice caps melt, as oceans heat up, as water tables plunge, as we rip through the delicate web of interdependence that sustains life on Earth, as our formidable intelligence leads us to breach the boundaries between humans and machines, and our even more formidable hubris undermines our ability to connect the survival of our planet to our survival as a species. As we replace art with algorithms and stare into a future in which most human beings may not be needed to participate in or be remunerated for economic activity, at just such a time, we have the steady hands of white supremacists in the White House, new imperialists in China, neo-Nazis once again massing on the streets of Europe, Hindu nationalists in India, and a host of butcher princes and lesser dictators in other countries to guide us into the unknown. While many of us dreamt that another world is possible, these folks were dreaming that too. And it is their dream, our nightmare, that is perilously close to being realized. Capitalism's gratuitous wars and sanctioned greed have jeopardized the planet and filled it with refugees. Much of the blame for this rests squarely on the shoulders of the government of the United States. 17 years after invading Afghanistan, after bombing it into the Stone Age with the sole aim of toppling the Taliban, the US government is back in talks with the very same Taliban. In the interim, it has helped to destroy Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Hundreds of thousands have lost their lives to war and sanctions. A whole region has descended into chaos. Ancient cities pounded into dust. Amidst the desolation and the rubble, a monstrosity called Daesh, ISIS, has been spawned. It has spread across the world, indiscriminately murdering ordinary people who had absolutely nothing to do with America's wars. Over these last few years, given the wars it has waged and the international treaties it has arbitrarily reneged on, the US government perfectly fits its own definition of a rogue state. And now, resorting to the same old scare tactics, the same tired falsehoods, and the same old fake news about nuclear weapons, it's gearing up to bomb Iran. That will be the biggest mistake it has ever made. So as we lurch into the future in this blitzkrieg of idiocy, Facebook likes, fascist marches, fake news coups, and what looks like a race towards extinction, what is literature's place? What counts as literature? Who decides? Obviously, there's no single edifying answer to these questions. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to talk about my own experience of being a writer during these times, of grappling with the question of how to be a writer during these times, in particular in a country like India, a country that lives in several centuries simultaneously. A few years ago, I was in a railway station reading the papers while I waited for my train. On an inside page, I spotted a small news report about two men who had been arrested and charged with being couriers for the banned underground Communist Party of India, Maoist. Among the items recovered from the men, the report said, were some books by Arundhati Roy. Not long after that, I met a college lecturer who spent much of her time organizing legal defense for jailed activists, many of them young students and villagers in prison for anti-national activities. For the most part, this meant protesting corporate mining and infrastructure projects that were displacing tens of thousands from their lands and homes. She told me that in several of the prisoners' confessions, usually extracted under coercion, my writing often merited a reference as a factor that led them down what the police call the wrong path. They're laying a trail, building a case against you, she said. The books in question were not my novels. At that point, I had only written one, The God of Small Things. These were books of nonfiction, although in a sense they were stories too. Different kinds of stories, but stories nevertheless. Stories about the massive corporate attack on forests, rivers, crops, seeds, on land, on farmers, labor laws, on policymaking itself, and yes, on the post-9/11 US and NATO attacks on country after country. Most were stories about people who have fought against these attacks, specific stories about specific rivers, specific mountains, specific corporations, specific people's movements, all of them being specifically crushed in specific ways. These were the real climate warriors, local people with a global message, who had understood the crisis before it was recognized as one. And yet they were consistently portrayed as villains, the anti-national impediments to progress and development. The former Prime Minister of India, a free market evangelist, called the guerrillas, mostly indigenous people, Adivasis, fighting corporate mining projects in the forests of central India, the single largest internal security challenge. A war called Operation Green Hunt was declared on them. The forests were flooded with soldiers whose enemies were the poorest people in the world. It's been no different elsewhere in Africa, Australia, Latin America. And now, irony of ironies, a consensus is building that climate change is the world's single largest security challenge. Increasingly, the vocabulary around it is being militarized. And no doubt, very soon, its victims will become the enemies in the new war without end. Calls for a climate emergency, although well-meaning, could hasten the process that has already begun. The pressure is already on to move the debate from the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to the United Nations Security Council. In other words, to exclude most of the world and place the decision-making straight back into the den of the same old suspects. Once again, the global north, the creators of the problem, will see to it that they profit from the solution that they propose, a solution whose genius will no doubt lie deep in the heart of the market and involve more selling and buying, more consuming, and more profiteering by fewer and fewer people. In other words, more capitalism. When the essays were first published in mass circulation magazines, then on the internet, and finally as books, they were viewed with baleful suspicion, at least in some quarters, often by those who didn't necessarily even disagree with the politics. The writing sat at an angle to what is conventionally thought of as literature. Balefulness was an understandable reaction, particularly among the taxonomy inclined, because they couldn't decide exactly what this was, pamphlet or polemic, academic or journalistic writing, travelogue, or just plain literary adventurism. To some, it simply didn't count as writing. Oh, why have you stopped writing? We're waiting for your next book. Others imagined that I was just a pen for hire. All manner of offers came my way. Darling, I loved that piece you wrote on the dams. Could you do one for me on child abuse? This actually happened. I was sternly lectured, mostly by upper caste men, about how to write, the subjects I should write about, and the tone I should take. But in other places, let's call them places off the highway, the essays were quickly translated into other Indian languages, printed as pamphlets, distributed for free in forests and river valleys, in villages that were under attack, on university campuses where students were fed up of being lied to. Because these readers out there on the front lines, already being singed by the spreading fire, had an entirely different idea of what literature is or ought to be. I mention this because it taught me that the place for literature is built by writers and readers. It's a fragile place in some ways, but an indestructible one. When it's broken, we rebuild it because we need shelter. I very much like the idea of literature that is needed, literature that provides shelter, shelter of all kinds. Over time, an unspoken compromise was arrived at. I began to be called a writer activist. Implicit in this categorization was that the fiction was not political and the essays were not literary. I remember sitting in a lecture hall in a college in Hyderabad in front of an audience of 500 or 600 students. On my left, chairing the event, was the Vice Chancellor of the university. On my right, a professor of poetry. The Vice Chancellor whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't spend any more time on fiction. Your political writing is the thing to concentrate on." The professor of poetry whispered, "When will you get back to writing fiction? That's your true calling. The other stuff you do is just ephemeral." I have never felt that my fiction and non-fiction were warring factions battling for suzerainty. They aren't the same, certainly, but trying to pin down the difference between them is harder than I imagined. Fact and fiction are not converse. One is not necessarily truer than the other, more factual than the other, or more real than the other, or even in my case, more widely read than the other. All I can say is that I feel the difference in my body when I'm writing. Sitting between the two professors, I enjoyed their contradictory advice. I sat there smiling, thinking of the first message I received from John Berger. It was a beautiful handwritten letter from a writer who had been my hero for many years. "Your fiction and non-fiction, they walk you around the world like your two legs." That settled it for me. Whatever the case was that was being built against me, it didn't, or at least hasn't yet come to fruition. I'm still here, standing on my two writing legs, speaking to you. But my lecturer friend is in jail, charged with participating in anti-national activity. India's prisons are packed tight with political prisoners, most of them accused of being either Maoist or Islamist terrorists. These terms have been defined so broadly that they have come to include almost anyone who disagrees with government policy. In the latest batch of pre-election arrests, teachers, lawyers, activists, and writers have been jailed, charged with plotting to assassinate Prime Minister Modi. The plot is so ludicrous that a 6-year-old could have improved on it. The fascists need to take some good fiction writing courses. Reporters Without Borders say that India is the 5th most dangerous place for journalists in the world, ranked just above Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Mexico. Here I must pause to thank PEN for the work it does to protect writers and journalists who have been imprisoned, prosecuted, censored, and worse. From one day to the next, it could be any one of us that is in the line of fire. To know that there's an organization looking out for us is a consolation. In India, those who've been jailed are the lucky ones. The less fortunate are dead. Gauri Lankesh, Narendra Dhabulkar, M.M. Kalburgi, and Govind Pansare all critics of the Hindu far right have been assassinated. Theirs were the high-profile killings. Scores of other activists working with the Right to Information Act to uncover massive corruption scandals have been killed or found dead in suspicious circumstances. Over the last 5 years, India has distinguished itself as a lynching nation. Muslims and Dalits have been publicly flogged and beaten to death by vigilante Hindu mobs in broad daylight, and the lynch videos then gleefully uploaded to YouTube. The violence is flagrant, open, and certainly not spontaneous. Although the violence against Muslims is not new, and the violence against Dalits is ancient, these lynchings have a clear ideological underpinning. The lynchers know that they have protection in the highest places, protection not just from the government and the Prime Minister, but from the organization that controls them both, the far-right, proto-fascist Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the RSS, the most secretive and most powerful organization in India. It was founded in 1925. Its founding ideologues were greatly influenced by European fascism. They openly praised Hitler and Mussolini and compared Indian Muslims to the Jews of Germany. It has worked ceaselessly for 95 years towards having India formally declared a Hindu nation. Its declared enemies are Muslims, Christians, and communists. The RSS runs a shadow government that functions through tens of thousands of shakhas, branches, and other ideologically affiliated organizations with different names, some of them astonishingly violent, spread across the country. Traditionally controlled by a sect of West Coast Brahmins known as Chitpavan Brahmins, the RSS today has white supremacists and racists from the United States and Europe circling around it, writing in praise of Hinduism's age-old practice of caste. It's what's more accurately known as Brahminism, a brutal system of social hierarchy they envy for its elaborate, institutionalized cruelty, which has survived more or less intact from ancient times. Brahminism also has admirers in the most unexpected places. One of them, you will be saddened to know, was Mohandas Gandhi, who considered caste to be the genius of Hindu society. I have written at length about Gandhi's attitude towards caste and race in a book called The Doctor and the Saint, so I will not dwell on it now. But let me just leave you with this. At a speech at a missionary conference in Madras in 1916, he said, quote, "The vast organization of caste answered not only the religious wants of the community, but it answered too its political needs. The villagers managed their internal affairs through the caste system, and through it they dealt with any oppression from the ruling power or powers. It is not possible to deny the organizing capability of a nation that was capable of producing the caste system, its wonderful power of organization." So for those of you who get your eyes glazed over when you hear about caste, just think about race and then think about it being consecrated by religion, and an extremely elaborate version of race in which every prejudice is institutionalized. Today, the RSS boasts of having a trained militia of 600,000 members who proudly call themselves Swayam Sevaks, volunteers, whose numbers include the Prime Minister and most of his cabinet. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, functions as the parliamentary political department of the RSS. Ram Madhav, its secretary, is a member of the RSS. By insisting on viewing the BJP as an independent entity, as an ordinary right-wing conservative political party, by inadvertently or deliberately minimizing its organic connection to the RSS, many in the Indian and international media as well as many who claim to be secular and liberal, have eased its path to political power. Modi's mainstream political career was launched coincidentally, or maybe not, just weeks after 9/11, when he was appointed as the Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat, although he was not an elected member of the Legislative Assembly. Within months of that appointment, under his watch, a pogrom against Muslims took place in Gujarat, in which 2,000 people were killed in broad daylight. Within months, he called elections and won. At a grand convention of businessmen and industrialists in Gujarat, CEOs of several of India's major corporations openly endorsed him as their future candidate for Prime Minister. Just after this genocidal killing, the captains of industry said, "This is our candidate for Prime Minister." Fascism and capitalism exchanged marriage vows in a not-so-quiet ceremony and moved in together. After 3 terms as Gujarat's chief minister, Modi was elected Prime Minister of India in 2014. He was given a hero's welcome by the liberal commentariat, and he has traveled the world embracing and being embraced by world leaders, including Barack Obama and Emmanuel Macron. And Donald Trump, of course, but that is no surprise. None of them is ignorant about who Modi really is, but all of them have something to sell to this market of more than 1 billion people. Now, after 5 years in office and a vicious communal campaign, he and his cohorts are seeking re-election. In what marks a dangerous turn of events, newspapers reported a public speech by Maneka Gandhi, a union minister in Modi's cabinet, in which she said that villages would be graded according to which ones voted for the BJP in the greatest numbers, and they would be rewarded or punished by the award or withholding of development proportionate to their loyalty. She's by no means the only one speaking this language, by no means the only one who has openly suggested that the party knows who has voted for it and who has not, and that retribution will follow. And by no means the first to hint that political parties have access to data from what is supposed to be a secret ballot, data that they can use to their advantage in dangerous ways that completely undermine elections and democracy itself. In the era of surveillance capitalism, a few people will know everything about us and will use information to control us. India is fighting for her soul. Even if the BJP loses the elections, which, despite having more money than all the other political parties put together, despite more or less complete control of the mainstream media, it well might. It will not mean that we're out of danger. The RSS is chameleon-like and moves on 1 million legs, capturing power with an absolute majority, as it did 5 years ago, put motors on those legs. But merely losing an election will not prevent it from continuing its long walk to hell. It can change color when it has to, wear a mask of reason and inclusiveness when it needs to. It has proved its ability to function as an underground organization as well as an overground one. It is a patient, hard-working beast that has burrowed its way into every institution in the country: courts, universities, media outlets, security forces, intelligence services. If a new non-BJP government is sworn in, most likely a fragile coalition, it is likely to be met by a ferocious onslaught of manufactured violence and false flag attacks to which we have become accustomed. There will be cow carcasses discovered on highways, beef found in temples, and pigs thrown into mosques. When the country burns, the far right will once again present themselves to us as the only ones capable of running a hard state and handling the problem. Will a polity that has been deeply polarized be able to see through these games? It's hard to say. Much of this has been the subject of my writing, fiction as well as non-fiction, for several years. The God of Small Things, published in the summer of '97, was the result of a search for a language and a form to describe the world I had grown up in, to myself and to people I loved, some of whom were entirely unfamiliar with Kerala. I had studied architecture, written screenplays, and now I wanted to write a novel that could only be a novel, not a novel that really wanted to be a film or a manifesto or a sociological treatise of some kind. I was astonished when some critics described it as a work of magical realism. How could that be? The setting of the book, the old house on the hill in Imanam, my grandmother's pickle factory that I grew up in, I still have some of the jars and labels. The Meenachil River, all of it gritty reality to me, was exotic and magical to many Western critics. Fair enough, but I reserve the right to think that way about New York and London. Back home in Kerala, the reception was pretty unmagical. The Communist Party of India, Marxist, which had ruled Kerala on and off since 1959, was upset with what it considered a critique of the party in The God of Small Things. I was quickly labeled anti-communist, a crying, talking, sleeping, walking imperialist plot. I had been critical, it's true, and the sharp end of my critique was that the left, by which I mean the various communist parties in India, has been not just opaque to caste, but more often than not, overtly casteist. The transgressive relationship in the novel between Ammu, a Syrian Christian woman, and Velita, a Dalit man, was viewed with consternation. The consternation had as much to do with the novel's politics of caste as it did with gender. The portrayal of one of the main characters, Comrade K.N.M. Pilla's relationship with his wife Kalyani, and of Ammu, a divorced woman who, quote, combined the infinite tenderness of motherhood and the reckless rage of a suicide bomber, who loved by night the man who her children loved by day, was not received with applause and hallelujahs. 5 male lawyers got together and filed a criminal case against me, accusing me of obscenity and corrupting public morality. There were factors outside of the novel that were swirling around too. My mother, Mary Roy, had won a case in the Supreme Court that struck down the Syrian Christian inheritance law, which gave a woman 1/4 of her father's property of 5,000 rupees, which is about $70, whichever is less. Women could now inherit an equal share. This caused a great deal of anger. There was a palpable sense that mother and daughter needed to be taught a lesson. By the time the case came up for its 3rd or 4th hearing, The God of Small Things had won the Booker Prize. That divided public opinion. A local Malayali woman winning a prestigious international literary prize was not something that could easily be dismissed. Should she be shunned or embraced? I was present in court with my lawyer, who had told me in confidence that he thought that parts of my book were quite obscene. But he said that according to the law, a work of art should be seen as a whole, and since the whole book was not obscene, we stood a fighting chance. The judge took his seat and said, "Every time this case comes before me, I get chest pains." He postponed the hearing. The judges who came after him did the same. Meanwhile, people celebrated the non-transgressive aspects of the book, the language, the evocation of childhood. But it's still hard for many to look at the relationship between Ammu and Velita without flinching. It took almost 10 years before the case was dismissed. In May 1998, less than a year after the publication of The God of Small Things, For the first time in India's history, a BJP-led coalition formed the government at the center. The Prime Minister at the time, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, was also a member of the RSS. Within weeks of taking office, he fulfilled a long-standing dream of the RSS by conducting a series of nuclear tests. Pakistan responded immediately with tests of its own. The nuclear tests were the beginning of the journey towards the crazed rhetoric of nationalism that has become a normal form of public speech in India today. I was taken aback by the orgy of celebration that greeted the nuclear tests, including from the most unexpected quarters. That was when I wrote my first essay, The End of Imagination, condemning the tests. I said that entering the nuclear race would colonize our imaginations. Quote, if it's anti-Indian and anti-Hindu to have a nuclear bomb implanted in my brain, then I secede. I hereby declare myself a mobile republic. I'll leave you to imagine the reaction that followed. The End of Imagination was the first of what would turn out to be 20 years of nonfiction essays. They were years during which India was changing at lightning speed. For each essay, I searched for a form, for language, for structure and narrative. Could I write as compellingly about irrigation as I could about love and loss and childhood, about the salinization of soil, about drainage, dams, crops, about structural adjustment and privatization, about the per unit cost of electricity, about things that affect ordinary people's lives, not as reportage, but as a form of storytelling. Was it possible to turn these topics into literature? Literature for everybody, including people who couldn't read and write, but who had taught me how to think and could be read to. I tried, and as the essays kept appearing, so did the 5 male lawyers. Not the same ones, different ones, but they seemed to hunt in packs. And so did the criminal cases, mostly for contempt of court. One of them ended in a very short jail sentence. Another is still pending. The debates were often acrimonious, sometimes violent, but always important. Almost every essay got me into enough trouble to make me promise myself that I wouldn't write another. But inevitably, situations arose in which the effort of keeping quiet set up such a noise in my head, such an ache in my blood, that I succumbed and wrote. Last year, when my publisher suggested they be collected into a single volume, I was shocked to see that the collection, My Seditious Heart, is 1,000 pages long. After 20 years of writing, traveling into the heart of rebellion, meeting most extraordinary as well as exquisitely ordinary people, fiction returned to me. It became clear that only a novel would be able to contain the universe that was building in me, spinning up from the landscapes that I had wandered through and composing itself into a story universe. I knew it would be unapologetically complicated, unapologetically political, and unapologetically intimate. I knew that if The God of Small Things was about home, about a family with a broken heart in its midst, the ministry of utmost happiness would begin after the roof had blown off the home and the broken heart had shattered and distributed its shards in war-torn valleys and city streets. It would be a novel, but the story universe would refuse all forms of domestication and conventions about what a novel could and could not be. It would be like a great city in my part of the world, in which the reader arrives as a new immigrant, a little frightened, a little intimidated, plenty excited. The only way to know it would be to walk through it, get lost, and learn to live in it. Learn to meet people, big and small, learn to love the crowd. It would be a novel that would say what otherwise cannot be said, particularly about Kashmir, where only fiction can be true because the truth cannot be told. In India, it is not possible to speak of Kashmir with any degree of honesty without risking bodily harm. About the story of Kashmir and India and Kashmir, I can do no better than to quote James Baldwin. And they would not believe me precisely because they would know that what I said was true. The story of Kashmir is not the sum of its human rights reports. It's not only about massacres, torture, disappearance, and mass graves. Hello, Indian Embassy. It's not, it's not only about victims and their oppressors. Some of the most terrifying things that happen in Kashmir would not necessarily qualify as human rights violations. For a writer, Kashmir holds great lessons about the human substance, about power and powerlessness, treachery, loyalty, love, humor, faith. What happens to people who live under a military occupation for decades? What are the negotiations that take place when the very air is seeded with terror? What happens to language? One of the first things I began to do when I began to travel in Kashmir is to collate what appears in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness as the Kashmiri English alphabet, starting with the letter A. A, Azadi. Azadi means freedom in Urdu. Azadi, Army, Allah, America, attack, AK-47, ammunition, ambush, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, area domination. B, BSF, the Border Security Force, body, blast, bullet, battalion, barbed wire, border cross, booby trap, bunker, begar, forced labor. C, cross-border, crossfire, camp, civilian, curfew, crackdown, coordinate search, checkpost, counterinsurgency, ceasefire, counterintelligence, catch and kill, custodial killing, compensation, concertina wire, collaborator, and so on. Also, what happens to people who administer, digest, and justify the horror? What happens to people who allow it to go on and on and on in their name? The narrative of Kashmir is a jigsaw puzzle whose jagged parts do not fit together. There is no final picture. Strange people made their way onto my pages, foremost among them Biplab Dasgupta, an intelligence officer. I was unnerved when he arrived, speaking in the first person. I thought I was in his head and realized later that perhaps he was in mine. What was chilling about him was not his villainy, but his reasonableness, his intelligence, his wit, his self-deprecation, his vulnerability. Even still, none of Dasgupta's sophistication and erudite political analysis can see what the building contractor, Mr. D.D. Gupta, one of the minor characters in the book, easily can. Mr. Gupta has returned to India from Iraq after several years of earning his living building blast walls, pictures of which he proudly stores in his mobile phone. Sickened by what he has seen and lived through in Iraq, he looks around at the place he used to think of as home. His considered assessment of what is happening in his own country is that all of it, in the long run, will only end up creating a market for blast walls. Novels can bring their authors to the brink of madness. Novels can shelter their authors too. As a writer, I protected the characters in The God of Small Things because they were vulnerable. Many of the characters in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness are, for the most part, even more vulnerable. But they protect me, especially Anjum, who was born as Aftab, who ends up as the proprietor and manager of the Jannat guest house. Jannat means paradise, of the Paradise Guest House, located in a derelict Muslim graveyard just outside the walls of Old Delhi. Anjum softens the borders between men and women, between animals and humans, and between life and death. I go to her when I need shelter from the tyranny of hard borders in this increasingly hardening world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's start with your most perceptive critics from that lecture, the police, who say that reading you is sort of for young, impressionable people to go down the wrong path. In other words, you're a writer who's created the wrong path. And then you talk about being labeled a writer activist. There is the vice chancellor whispering in your ear that you should write politics, the nonfiction, not fiction, and the poet who says you should write fiction, not nonfiction. What is it about your writing that constantly makes largely men, but a lot of people constantly want to correct your course? What is it about your writing that is so provocative?
You must ask them. Well, I mean, I'm sure a lot of women in the audience will agree that it isn't just me that gets advice, right? It's like maybe it's something about my body. But yeah, but you know, I mean, I think I don't. You know, obviously, when I was younger and it first started, I was, you know, I used to prevent myself from reacting to it, but just keep doing what I want to do. But now, you know, I also see that we're living through such turbulent times and things are changing and were changing. It's almost like nothing that, there's no firm ground to stand on, you know. So everybody's, you know, everybody's in flux and everybody's talking and advising and, you know, telling everyone else what to do, which is okay, I mean.
But what is it that makes you sort of love both fiction and nonfiction equally? Why do you feel the need to engage with characters? For instance, let's talk about Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Let's talk about that really menacing intelligence official character, Biplab Dasgupta, you talked about, and how he's sitting in your head. What makes you want to tackle that on the one hand in fiction, at the same time as a non-fiction writer, you spend tremendous amounts of time doing research. You talk in your lecture about the need to write about irrigation, for instance. What is it that draws you into these things? What drives it?
I don't know, truly. I mean, I think it's, you know, the basic DNA of a writer and a storyteller is one that seeks understanding. You know, one is curious, and I think you know, when there's a lot of pressure on you, it was John Berger. You know, he once wrote to me saying, you know, I sometimes used to wonder why you just go on and on writing when you guys are just getting pushed back and pushed against the wall. And then he said, I understand that ultimately you do it to tell them, I'll never be zero. Like, whatever you do, I know what you're doing. Like, we know what you're doing to us. And we're going to put it down, even if we don't win. We're not going to disappear without a trace, you know. And to seek an understanding. I think one of the things is also peculiarly in India, you know, it's such a stratified society in caste, in language, and so on. A lot of the sort of celebrated fiction writers who write in English, ultimately, unless you make the effort to drop through the trap door, you do not understand the place you live in. So even now, when I'm in Delhi, like I was talking to you earlier about the fact that I had to, the language of the elections is like the science of the occult, and it's only about caste. It's only about caste, and the rest of the time we pretend that we've overcome it and so on. But actually, caste is such a stratified thing there that people are just locked into their little airtight containers, and to me, also because I'm such a mix, I don't actually, so it's not easy to pinpoint me, such a mongrel in some ways, but writing about it, traveling, arguing, or even say going to Kashmir now, you as an Indian, you can't go in there, because people don't trust, but it's the writing that takes me in there. My real royalties, like I've always said, is that instead of money, you just got to say, hey, I wrote this, will you give me lunch? It's like I travel into the hearts of these rebellions based on what one has written before, So it's curiosity, I'd say, the answer to your question. It is like, how can you write a novel if you don't, like to me, walking down the city of Delhi, I can't just walk down down a road and think, oh, this is a postman, this is a guard, this is a beggar. No, they all have stories. They've come from somewhere, and it's such an incredible thing when you start to see it, who are, the internally displaced in India are running in the millions, just because there's a country border. It doesn't mean that the trauma of displacement hasn't taken place. So to me, as a writer, I like to know. I like to get my bearings, and that gets me into trouble, that takes me places, but that, yeah.
I mean, when you're in Delhi, we were in Delhi when the God of Small Things came out, and we didn't know each other. And I remember, seeing you being celebrated in the Indian media for the God of Small Things winning the Booker. And you were this very famous person, this distant person. And then in '98, when the BJP won the elections and it did the nuclear tests, and there was this wave of nationalism and militarism in the country. And you've described how over 20 years that has sort of continued. And you decided to publish this essay called The End of Imagination. And it was like a counter-punch. It was like a slap in the face of that nationalism. But it was a very unusual decision to take. I mean, again, what made you want to take on Indian nationalism when you were being celebrated as a kind of, one of the great Indian icons of writing? What made you write The End of Imagination?
Precisely that, because I mean, just at that time, I was like on the cover of every magazine and his book. And one of the reasons I was distant is that because as soon as I won the Booker, I just took a deep dive. I didn't do a single interview. I just didn't want to be that person, And then when, that doesn't prevent you from being on the covers of magazines. It's not always your decision. But when the nuclear tests happened, it was just automatically assumed that, I was one of the sort of people on the National Pride Parade, I was presented as this other thing that India has to offer: beauty, queens, Booker winners, nuclear bombs, all of it. And I was like, no, I'm not in that compartment, I'm jumping off. So
you seceded.
It was like, actually it was so clearly that I understood that saying nothing was as political as saying something. To me, it was as political because I was being then included in something I didn't want to be included in.
So saying nothing is as political as saying something?
Yeah, I mean, in my circumstance at that time it was, because I was a very, very public person. I mean, you know, I had not set out to be that person, but I had become that person.
Right.
And so to not say something meant that you were going along with it, which was just not acceptable to me, you know.
And then you sort of went on this sort of journey of describing the protests against the dam in Narmada, in Kashmir. I mean, essentially for 20 years, you've kind of tracked the history of India, which is, but you know, but that might seem a little distant to people out here. So how do we connect that to the bigger questions of climate change and writing and power? I mean, in your lecture, you said literature is built by readers and writers. How do we connect that if you are living in America, for which many of our audience are, and if you're a writer here?
You know, Siddharth, when I wrote The God of Small Things, it's about a little village in South India, you know, where I grew up. I would have thought that's very distant from everybody here, but it wasn't, you know. So I just think that readers have a radar. You don't need to cater to them. I don't need to cater to you, do I? I don't think so. Like, I think people read things and they extrapolate and they understand. One of the things I did decide to do after I started writing the political essay, even before, was that I didn't want to be that interpreter of the East to the West. I didn't want to end up having to explain things in some sociological way to Western audiences, because I said they're going to walk that extra mile if they want or don't want, it's okay, you know. It came from a peculiar lack of ambition also. I was just like, I live there, I'm writing there. If someone wants to read it, it's fine. If they don't, it's fine, you know. So, but it turned out that people, like for example, let's say when I was reading this today, I'm sure that you understand the connections in your head between something like the RSS, the Ku Klux Klan, racism, supremacy. You know, the fact that in India the RSS and the caste system is probably the most ancient institutionalized form of discrimination, but at its center is this Aryan supremacy and all of that. So people understand, you know, and I believe that when you're really specific about what you know, is better than trying to generalize for people, because they don't want that, or I don't know what people want, but I mean, I just write the way I write, you know. Then, I think there's something wonderful about how universal things can be. Like people, I remember this translator of mine in Estonia saying to me, but how did you know about my childhood? You know, the God of Small Things. Right. Or someone in Poland. I mean, I thought that the Ministry of Utmost Happiness would be it is a more difficult book, but it's translated into 51 languages.
Right, right.
In Poland, someone told me, but this is about Poland, you know. So it's, I think readers are as mysterious as writers.
Yeah, I mean, again, one sees that, you know, with childhood, it is easier, I imagine, in some ways for readers to identify with that. But again, I'm also so interested in the amount of work that has gone into the nonfiction writing and finding a form. And you talk about it. You talk about the need to find a way to tell a story about dams, because dams involves, you know, geology, it involves waters, it involves irrigation, which are not exactly the subjects one thinks of as a writer or a reader of novels. But I also want to connect that with this question of this sense of crisis that we live in, this age of climate change, that this is somehow connected. Again, I mean, what advice do you have for other people who are writing, who want to become writers wherever they are? How do you grapple? Because, you know, one's own childhood, yes, that is something that can be mined in a slightly, direct fashion. But how do you go about writing about migrants or immigrants or, about the climate change crisis, things like that? How do you do it as a writer?
Well, I mean, I guess there aren't any rules, you know. I mean, everybody has. I'm terrible at giving advice,
Yes.
but but I think that in my case, you know, there's a slight like I feel humiliated if I don't understand. You know, it's like. So often when you look at a conflict, even, I mean, one of my essays, I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago or 10 years ago, maybe, it was about how in the mountains of Orissa in eastern India,
In Niyamgiri.
the flat mountains, the sign of bauxite is the flat top mountains, you know, and how the value of that mountain means such different things to different people. Like to
Yes.
the mining company, it is just the value of the bauxite that you can take out of it.
Yes.
But to the people who live there, they see and understand that bauxite is a porous rock, and therefore it functions as a kind of water tank, and it holds the water that irrigates the plains, that sustains the life, and so it's meaningless outside the mountain.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and that essay ended with saying, "Can we leave the bauxite in the mountain?" Because
No.
ultimately, unless you have an imagination that can leave the bauxite in the mountain, we're doomed. And unless if you don't have it, at least don't wipe out the people who do have it, that imagination, you
Yes.
know. So one of the things that fascinates me about India, even though that's where I've born, that's where I've grown up, that's where I live, and that's where I continue to be fascinated, because there is still a wilderness there, a wilderness of the imagination, an understanding there's a different way of living, you know, and that is what is under assault.
Yes, and actually it reminds me very much of the kind of conversations here around Standing Rock, the kind, from which I've been learning from Native American comrades in the United States, in Canada, exactly the same kind of debate against sort of extraction of fossil fuels, the sheer violence of that. But we are running out of time, and I wanted to at least get you to talk about these lines in the lecture that I really like. When you talk about Ministry of Utmost Happiness, you talk about the reader. It's a world where the reader arrives as a new immigrant. And I like that metaphor that you've chosen, I imagine very deliberately. A little frightened, a little intimidated, plenty excited. Is this what you're telling us, the next lines? The only way to know it would be to walk through it, get lost, and learn to live in it. Learn to meet people, small and big. Learn to love the crowd. Is that
Well, it
what
is.
you're telling
I mean,
us?
yeah, because as I said in the lecture, studied architecture. I was very interested in the idea of cities, of urban planning, and then, I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about the setting of the book as there are parts of the book that are set in Delhi as a city, but the structure of a novel. I thought, look at a city, you know, in our place, ancient, broken, remade, modern, planned, unplanned, you know, and yet always it has that form, you know, and I felt like, you know, people are domesticating novels. They weren't always, but there is this sense of, you know, like you have these few characters and you know them intimately. What happened? We have to stop.
We have to stop. We've run out of time.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Arundhati. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay there. That's a good idea.
Wait, the right will be the key. I will sign you up.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's wait. Let's get
Bye.
have her applause. Let's go through our rules and then all this. I'm Suzanne Noss. I'm the CEO of PEN America. I want to thank Arundhati Roy and Siddhartha Deb for bringing this year's PEN World Voices Festival to such an inspiring, impassioned close. There are so many beautiful lines and metaphors and images from that talk that I don't think any of us here will ever forget. This marks the 15th annual PEN World Voices Festival, a testament to the idea that dialogue across borders, tuning in directly to other cultures and bridging geographic, political, and ideological divides is one that has staying power. Thank you all for making this journey with us. I want to thank Hannah Essa, Nolini Barreto, Kojo Ade, Tricia Pearson, Claudia Norman, Jody Koo, Chris Amundsen, Suzanne Chisholm, Harold Norris, Michael DeFonso, Boost Patron, and Overland Entertainment, and our many co-presenting partners. I want to thank the PEN America Board of Trustees, our amazing staff, and our fleets of dedicated and indispensable interns and volunteers. And above all, I want to thank Kim Chan, the General Manager of the PEN World Voices Festival, and Chip Rowley, the festival director. Without their blood, sweat, tears, vision, and passion, this week would not have been possible. Arundhati taught us that the place for literature is built by writers and readers. Whether you're a writer or a reader, I hope you'll join PEN in building that place. Please don't wait for the 2020 festival. I know you can't wait, but go to our website, support an imprisoned writer, volunteer, sign a petition, attend an event. You can sign up outside. Saying nothing is as political as saying something. That's what Arundhati taught us tonight, so I hope you'll join us in speaking out. Thank you so much, and good evening.